Welcome, everyone. My name is Nick Tyrone. I'm a writer and a journalist, passionate pro-European. I'm trying to give you as much of the history that's relevant as possible. The first thing to say is probably the writing that is most relevant, that I do on an ongoing basis that's most relevant to this conversation is every week I put out a Substack called This Week in Brexit Land, where I just talk about any number of things. Some of them might be very much related to Brexit. Some of them might tangentially be related to Brexit. But I do it every week, and I have done since September 2021. And I started it just because I felt like there were some things about the Brexit debate that just weren't getting said enough. Going back and sort of trying to figure out the roots of my pro-European feelings, I grew up in Canada, English parents who had emigrated to Canada. And I think actually I've often thought, particularly since 2016, that probably has actually weirdly a lot to do with why I'm so pro-European because as most people do when they live in Canada, I was very close to the American border, and it remains the case. Certainly was when I was a young man. Was working in America if you were Canadian was extremely difficult. Basically, if you weren't American, and I think it's one of the reasons why I feel so passionate about freedom of movement and why it's so important to me and why so much the whole Brexit thing that has bothered me around the discussion around freedom of movement, which seems to come from a place of people who don't seem who have had a privilege of being able to work wherever they wanted in their own continent their whole lives and can't imagine that not being the case, and certainly that Brexit would have nothing to do with that. I ran so going back a little bit, I used to work for the Electoral Reform Society. I did so for 3 years. I ran a lot of events, a lot of outreach for them, and I started doing just simply because I was passionate about it and I had the budget. I did a lot of events on Europe, which was very interesting because the tone of those conversations were so different to the post 2016 conversations. Back then the Brexiteers all had a plan. It was all they knew exactly what was going to happen, and it was all going to be great. And just you wait and see. And the US is going to give us a great trade deal, and the EU will crumble in the face of Brexit and give Britain everything that it would ever desire with no reciprocation, all that sort of stuff. And then of course that's vastly changed. But I ran a lot of events on Europe between 2010 and the 2015 general election, which again have really shaped my pro-European feelings then and have strengthened them since, because it's obvious that when you spend 5 years speaking to people and they say similar things the whole time, and then suddenly we vote for Brexit, and then it completely changes and everything is completely different, and they never said any of that stuff. Or if they said some of that stuff, it was misunderstood or what have you. Uh, yeah. And I ran a think tank called Centreforum for a bit. So I have basically, I come from a think tank, NGO journalism background. I did work for a period on the Remain campaign, which I will talk about, not particularly my part in it, which wasn't particularly important at all, but actually some things about the Remain campaign that I think are relevant to this conversation that are not that widely known, oddly enough, even this far after the event. Um, so yeah, I am going to say some things that I think you'll like and find inspiring, and then I'm certain there are probably things that you won't want to hear or you won't like. But what I want to do is be totally honest, because I think the thing that the Brexit debate misses more than anything else is honesty, oddly, and that goes right back to the referendum. Both the Remain campaign and the Leave campaigns were mostly just a tissue of lies on either side, which is really unfortunate. And I feel like the tone of that debate has kind of persisted, and so much is just layer upon layer of dishonesty. And I feel like what I want to do is be as honest as I can about what I know, what I think, what I feel, and where I think this debate is going. So, as the title would tell you, I'm splitting this into two bits. So the first is the reasons to feel cheerful. So that's the bit I think you'll like. And then reasons to despair, which is the bit you may not like or may disagree with. So yeah, reasons to feel cheerful. I think number one reason to feel cheerful as a pro-European in Britain in 2024 is the polling actually is really unbelievable and actually isn't talked about enough and is incredibly remarkable and tends to be um, its impact is talked down really in the media. I think to be in a place where we're getting 60% roundabouts consistently for rejoin this soon after Brexit has happened is remarkable. I would have never thought that was possible. I really would have thought that at least there would have been a 5 year grace period where Brexit was really given its own kind of, leeway. And you probably would have seen polls that were, sort of 55-45 stay out at best. And the fact that we're seeing 60% rejoin is amazing. And actually, a poll from January of last year that again isn't remarked upon enough is Matthew Goodwin did a poll for his people polling, I think it's called. He did one, um, and he did a poll basically on the idea that he wanted to find out. Okay, fine, we're seeing all these polls that say rejoin or have a majority. There's a majority rejoin feeling, but what would happen if you told people that you had to take the euro, freedom of movement, all that stuff, and you put it in people's face? What would happen? And I think this poll from Goodwin isn't remarked upon enough. He obviously doesn't talk about it very much himself for reasons that will become immediately clear because he did the first one, which was just, would you like to rejoin the European Union or stay out? And that was 56 rejoin, 44 stay out. But then after he told everybody about you'd have to take the euro, we'd have to have freedom of movement back, it that shrank to 52 rejoin, 48 stay out. Not only a majority for rejoin, but actually a very significant number for reasons I don't really need to tell you, which I found very hilarious because he said that in this case, well, yes, fine, rejoin still has a lead, but it's barely statistically significant, which I think any Brexiter saying that a 52-48 margin is barely statistically insignificant is fairly hilarious. Anyway, I think the second reason to feel good about things is it still matters enough for people to keep the issue alive. It just won't die. Part of that is there's enough people on the Remain side who still feel very passionately about it and don't feel like giving in. Partly, a lot of people on the Remain side who felt like, okay, well, I really wanted to stay in, but okay, we voted out, and I guess we'll have to live with it. And who have seen how much dishonesty has gone on around the debate and are feeling upset about it. I think in Westminster there are a lot more people, there are a lot more politicians who are much more disgruntled with Brexit, much more annoyed about it than you would think from the what you see in public. Obviously, because both main parties have basically a above board pro Brexit stance. So obviously, people don't raise their head above the parapet. But the fact is, actually, a lot of MPs, a lot of Tory MPs, which might surprise you, are sort of like, I mean, the amount of times you'd be in Westminster, the lobby or something, and somebody would be like, I read your thing, I read your This Week in Brexit. You're right about that. Yeah, it's a bit shit, this Brexit, isn't it? From people that you would never think would ever say that. It's quite staggering. But also, I think it gets kept alive because I think the Brexiters are their own worst enemy with this stuff. It's like they cannot shut up about it. You see all the stuff in the Daily Express, and I think it's actually to a certain extent. I think it's good for us because I think the more they keep it alive, the more they're keeping it alive. They're keeping it alive as an issue, and well, why they can't see that, I don't know. I think that they never really understood how to win the peace. I think they've never really tried, and it's kind of too late now. I think part of it is they think that just keeping the Brexit wars alive is somehow going to reward the Conservative Party, even though the polls and every electoral event for the last several years have demonstrated that that is not the case. They still cling to this. I sort of the analogy I always come to is that they're like a murderer who keeps going to the scene of the crime. They kind of can't help themselves, even though they're sort of doing themselves the worst possible thing they could do from their own perspective. They keep doing it. The third and final reason, I think, to feel hopeful is the arguments on the Brexiter side are increasingly desperate and actually downright silly. I mean, we're seeing, I'd like to say we've reached the nadir with something like the pints of wine but actually there'll be stupider things to come. I can guarantee it, because that's where they are. If that's where they are in 2024, imagine where they are in 2026. I mean, it will be really, I can't even begin to imagine what it will be, but really desperate stuff. Or that one Tory MP talking about whatever it was, shellfish in the Thames, and it's just it's just it's transparently silly, and it's because they don't have anything else, and so they're the combination, if you like, of them desperate to keep it alive, but actually having nothing to say that's really good, or really positive, or all these Brexit benefits sort of not coming to fruition, means they're just kind of constantly shooting themselves in the foot. So I will conclude that's the positive part of the program. The I'm going to take a sip of tea and then reasons to feel glum. Right. Okay. So the fact that the political class is at least publicly united in feeling like Brexit is either a done deal or actually has to go further in some way, which you obviously have within the Conservative Party, that can't really be laughed away, and it's a real problem, and it's really difficult. And actually getting back to, in order to rejoin, we'd have to get back to a place where not only one party was vocally, was vocally rejoined, really. You would really have to get to a point where at least one party was vocally rejoined, and at the very, very least, the other one was split in some way. But within that split, the pro-rejoin people were very vocal and very passionate. And I mean, I don't need to tell you that we're absolutely nowhere near that at all. Even the most pro-European MPs are mostly silent or mostly kind of qualifying on it. Oh, well, we need a closer relationship, etc. So that, I think that's a huge reason to. It's a huge thing to overcome, and it's not obvious immediately how we overcome it. I mean, my hope with Starmer has always been that basically he will try and make Brexit work, and in doing so, he will have demonstrated that you've had a Tory government that tried to make Brexit work, and then you had a Labour government that tried to make Brexit work. And I think there is a real value in that, because actually, I think that will convince a few of the Brexit is good but it hasn't been done properly yet crowd to go, actually, no, we've given it a shot and it's bad. So I think there will be positives that will come out of it. Also, I think it will be increasingly difficult for Starmer to hold on to his current position when so much of his party is pro-European, really, in its roots, in its core. But nonetheless, I still think it's going to be big to try and overcome that, and it is a real reason to. If you're looking at the challenges, that's number one, and then the second one is. I have worked for a long time. As I say, I'll come on to. I worked on the Remain campaign for a bit, and I have worked. I've been around, and I know a lot of the people who are running the main pro-European political campaigning groups, and I have to be honest and say it's been mostly really, really depressing, and actually quite a crushing experience from my perspective as a pro-European who's desperate to do whatever I can and feels like I think there's lots more we could be doing, and there's just a whole other tier of campaign we could be doing, and it's not being done. I found it a bit crushing. I mean, to start with the European movement. I mean, one of the things about the European movement. So I saw I was at Labour conference. It wasn't 20. This was 2022, and I saw Mike Galsworthy, some of the other kind of associated European movement adjacent people, and they said, "Oh, we're doing this event, and then we're doing this. We're having this drinks reception. You should come by." So I came by, and it was pretty depressing. I mean, for a start, it was something that was very reminiscent to me of when I worked at the Electoral Reform Society, where you sort of had these conversations with Labour MPs or Labour figures, Labour peers or whatever, and they would always say, "Oh, electoral reform's wonderful. It's really, really wonderful, but we can't really say anything about that right now." Or we have our support, but actually the unions don't like it. There was always some reason why they couldn't openly support it, and it was a bit like there really were no MPs there. They'd rented a big room in Liverpool, put on a big spread, and like the Labour Party just did not show up. And then I was talking to them. I was like, "Well, what are you doing at Conservative conference?" And they said, "Well, nothing." And I said, "Oh, why aren't you doing anything at Tory conference?" They said, "Oh, well, we've been banned." They didn't. They weren't. They wouldn't approve our passes. To which I completely flipped out about it, and I just said, "Well, what are you doing? You should be. I mean, You should have guys there, talking to the press, saying we have been banned from Conservative Party conference. The European movement. Winston Churchill's blah 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 blah, and now we are banned from Conservative conference." And they just said, "No, no, no." And then I sort of pressured them, and they said, "Well, we just don't really see ourselves as a campaigning group. We're a membership group. That's really what we are." And it's sort of like when you talk to anybody, that's kind of what you get back. It's like, oh, well, we're not a campaigning group. And just for background, I sort of tried to start one myself. This was about a year back, and I just sort of I came to the conclusion that there just weren't that enough people in positions of funding, authority, etc., who really wanted to do it. There was a feeling of, well, now's not the right time. What we really need to do is coast for a bit. So, I mean, another reason to worry is if suddenly Keir Starmer wins the general election and says, "Okay, that's it. I think we should rejoin. We'll have a referendum in 6 months." I'd really be worried about losing because actually, there's the campaigning back, like the campaigning nexus to do this is not together. It is not there, and in fact, a lot of it is just leftover Remain campaign, which I mean, like I don't want to go over that too much to sort of reboil old soup, as it were. But I think it's kind of I think just a little bit on it is important. I mean, one of the reasons the 2016 referendum campaign was not very good was it was very poorly organized. It was very poorly organized in a very specific way, which is the stronger in people always saw themselves for a long time anyway, up until it was far too late, like until they were weeks away from polling day, as a sort of holding, like a holding cell for what was going to eventually be the real campaign, which was Cameron coming over the mountain. He couldn't do it at the time. This is like end of 2015, very early, but this time 2016, because he was doing this renegotiation with Brussels, and he couldn't openly say, there was this whole kind of pantomime that Cameron was doing, if you remember at the time, which was, well, I haven't decided which way I'm going to, go in the referendum, because if Brussels doesn't give me what I want, I mean, I might have to campaign for leave, etc., which was obviously always horseshit. I mean, he was always going to campaign for Remain, but he couldn't say so out loud. So the stronger in people really had this feeling of, well, we just have to kind of get some messages out, hold the fort, get some stuff going, and then Cameron and his, army is going to ride over the hill, and they're going to be the ones who win it. And meanwhile, number 10 thought, well, we don't really want to get involved because, we'll have a party to put together at the end of this, and does Cameron want to be in the newspapers fighting with Boris Johnson or Michael Gove every day? No. So there was a sort of like, well, he'll do what he has to do and he'll give a few key speeches, but he's not really going to put any campaigning weight behind it. So you sort of had almost like two sides of the campaign, neither of which thought they were like the real campaign. And I only mention it really not to rake over the coals or talk about 2016 any more than we have to, but I actually think there's something about that mentality that has always stayed. There's always been this slight, like, someone else is going to do it at some point. Like, at some point, some magical people will just ride in. We don't know who they are, but they will come in and they will save the day. And it's not going to be us. What we're going to do is we're just going to do our very safe thing. And I mean, you know, I feel like one of the things that depresses me about a lot of pro-European campaigning, such as it is at the moment, is it sort of just gets added to a stock list, I feel, of it's like part of a lifestyle, sort of buffet for certain, it's like, oh, there's a bit of PR over here and there's whatever about Palestine over here, and pro-European sort of campaign, that's just part of it, and it's just part of an array, and a pretty weak part actually at the moment. There's a real feeling of yeah, there's an incredible lack of energy there, incredible lack, probably way less than you think, because basically, these people have social media accounts and they're pumping stuff out, but really it's like it's three or four young people who are pumping a bunch of stuff out, and then really behind the scenes it's a bit like, well, what, we can't, there's no, it's almost like when in the conversations that I had sort of a year ago, it was a bit like, it was sort of like this dawning on them. You'd be in a pub with someone and they'd be like, you really you're really serious about this. You really think we can rejoin sometime relatively soon, don't you? Because that feeling is not widespread amongst pro-European people in Westminster. They're just, yeah, they're treading water really badly, and that makes me feel very depressed. And yeah, uh, so you combine those two things: the fact that you've got no, you got no support in Westminster that's open from politicians, and then you have campaigning groups who are basically in standby mode. And honestly, that's the thing that worries me the most, because I really look at the Brexiters, and they are they have nothing. They've got nothing at all. It's why the Express runs it's why you have pints of wine. It's why you have Sweden's gonna, whatever, the Express's bi-monthly, Sweden's gonna leave next week or whatever. Because they just don't have anything at all, and actually are mostly relying on the other side to continue just floating around in jelly. And that's the biggest thing that just makes me feel depressed about it. I mean, I would love to do more. And in fact, I really wanted to spend a lot more time and energy on trying to get us to rejoin. And I basically just had to pack it in for my own sanity. Like, just for the time being, I haven't given in, and I still think we'll rejoin. And there's a time when I will get back involved. But I just, I couldn't force a whole pack of people in London to suddenly go, oh yeah, this is important. Oh yeah, we should do this, when they didn't want to do that. They wanted to run their membership organizations and do whatever. And you sometimes in life, and particularly in politics, you just have to accept that that's the reality on the ground. So uh, I will end it there, because what I want to do is get to people's questions. I'm really interested in what questions you guys have. Um, so I will open up the floor to questions.